Hello, good afternoon and welcome along to this latest Aura webinar. This is in fact the final Aura webinar of 2020. It has been quite a year. I am Tom Kerr of Aura and I'm thrilled to be your host today. This event is called Beyond Binary, How Brands Can Navigate Gender Representation. Suitably poised and socially distanced in their respective places of work, whether it be the office, the kitchen, study, bedroom or bathroom. Oh, well, probably not the bathroom. Well, I hope not the bathroom anyway. That would be a desperate measure. But then again, if needs must in these strange times, then so be it. Anyway, as I was saying before I got distracted by myself, suitably poised and raring to go, we have Katrina Russell, Project Director at Sign Salad, where she uses cultural insight and semiotic analysis to help brands understand the motivation behind everyday decision making. And I should add, the winner on Monday afternoon of the MRS Award for Cultural Insight. And this is on top of winning the much coveted Aura Insight Impact Award at the Spectacular Auras last September. So congratulations to Katrina and Sign Salad on their success. We're also joined by Michelle Milner of the 7 Stars, the UK's largest independent media agency, where they ensure customer insight sits at the heart of client thinking. More power to your elbow. And Holly Jordan, Research Director, and Shazia Ganai of Neuro-Insight, who work with clients to understand how the brain responds to communication. That's quite a lineup, I'm sure you'll agree. We will be exploring the changing role of gender in advertising, and we'll hear how brands can navigate the rapidly shifting landscape of gender today, i.e. what gender now means. An issue I know the Census Committee have been grappling with in recent times. Seemingly there are 26 classifications of gender and counting. For this research, our presenters have combined methodologies to uncover groundbreaking insights. And in this session today, they will set out some practical recommendations that every brand should consider when representing gender in marketing. Before I leave you, let me remind you to drop your answers into the Q&A box at bottom center of screen. The Q&A box, please, not the chat box, the Q&A box. Pop your questions in as we go along. We'll deal with them at the end of the presentation. Believe me when I say it's a lot less enervating to see questions mount up as we go along than to get to a presentation end with a box full of, well, nothing. And also take note that we will launch a poll towards the end of question time, so be prepared to give your rating for the presentation. It's one question only. Please do take time to complete that poll. It helps us enormously. So that's it. Your introduction is over. The scene is set. It's now time for me to put myself on mute and hand you over to Shazia.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you enjoy what we're about to take you through. So I'm Shazia Ganai, the CEO of Neuro-Insight UK, and I'd like to welcome you today. Whether you're a him, a her, a them or a Z, we're including everyone today in a conversation that's really important about a fascinating subject. This white paper that we've launched, that we're sharing some insight from today with you, was a real labour of love, and over the course of the lockdown we somehow managed to all plug together and create this really great work, which we're all super proud of. As you've just been told, the work was done as a collaboration between 3 agencies, and I'm going to, without further ado, pass over to Katrina Russell, who's going to start taking you through some of what we did.
Great, thank you, Shazia. Hi everyone, Katrina here, Project Director at Sign Salad, and thank you so much, Tom, as well for the introduction. So why now? As we near the end of 2020, why are we looking at gender at this moment? So the representation of gender and the debate surrounding it has never been more present in public consciousness, or indeed more complicated. 2020 has been a year of significant social challenge and change, from COVID-19 to the Black Lives Matter movements, both of which have really revealed persistent unevenness in terms of gender equality and opened up a lot of questions again that we maybe thought we'd started to actually answer. Gender is also on the agenda in pop culture. So in a first with the Star Trek franchise, it's been announced this year that characters who are non-binary and gender fluid will be appearing in the 3rd season of Star Trek Discovery. Very exciting. Meanwhile, less positively, author J.K. Rowling has been caught in a media storm following her controversial tweets and comments on transgender people. So paying attention to these evolving discussions around gender presents a real opportunity to better understand the current and future relevance of gender representation in society. As we'll see, the last 8 decades have seen a great deal of change in cultural conceptions of gender and gendered behaviours. Traditional binary constructions of masculinity and femininity are increasingly being problematized, while issues surrounding gender inequality and exploitation remain the subject of heated debate. Indeed, actually, in this presentation, we'll often be using terms such as male and female throughout. This is the vocabulary of gender that has become the mainstream. It's the vocabulary that we are also challenging, as we'll see, yet it is one we will occasionally defer to when describing mainstream culture. On that note, it has never been more important for brands and their guardians to remain informed of and engage with these exact developments around the meaning of identity and identity representation. But before getting into things, we've prepared a short video looking at the cultural and historical conditions that led to this point.
Gender is a social construct. Our understanding of what gender means and how it is represented is ingrained within society and has evolved over time. Brands have historically reflected gender narratives through advertising, and mass media continues to reinforce dominant gender roles. But once typical representations of gender can now cause widespread offence, whether that's due to industry regulations or the call-out culture of social media. Over time, countercultures have challenged the status quo and questioned the binary and rigid representation of gender. This has empowered consumers with a more nuanced appreciation for the gender spectrum.
Hello?
Hello, am I talking to Gemma?
And what's your name?
It's James. Beyond Binary is a thought leadership research study which explores how brands can navigate the evolving gender landscape.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through what exactly we did. So as Katrina said, the topic of gender is really complex, but it's also incredibly fascinating, and frankly, we could talk about it for hours. But for our white paper, though, we've kept it quite focused and actually kept it quite UK focused, but we do reference other markets given the globally connected nature of mass culture. So this paper was created through a really fun and rewarding collaboration between our 3 agencies using a mixture of all of our expertise and our methodologies. And the paper consists of both primary and secondary research. In-depth historical analysis of gender representation across previous decades supported the cultural insight and semiotic analysis into the present day. And the measurement of the subconscious allowed us to tap into how existing associations around binary gender have constructed the context within which we live today. So for more people who are less familiar with semiotics and the neuro research, I guess I should explain a little bit about, exactly what that looks like. So semiotics identifies the cultural codes that includes visual linguistics, signs, symbols, and narratives of the world around us. And cultural codes really strongly influence consumer behavior, the motivations and attitudes, even if consumers aren't really necessarily overtly aware of the impact of it. And then research into the subconscious gendered responses to ad communication. That was conducted by us at Neuro-Insight using our patented technology of steady state topography, or SST for short. And the SST neuro method measures electrical activity in the different regions of the brain corresponding to different cognitive functions. And we measure this on a second-by-second basis, so it's incredibly granular. We measure what goes into long-term memory, which is really important for brands because that correlates directly with future action, decision-making, and behavior change. But we all know that our memories are encoded into our brains alongside an associated emotion. That's an evolutionary mechanism in humans. So we also look at parts of the brain that are responsible for emotion. One of the ones that you'll see referred to in some of the slides later on is what we call engagement, and that actually reflects a sense of personal relevance. We also, on that emotional side, look at something we call approach and withdrawal, and this is a measure of the direction of emotion or polarity of emotion that you might experience. It's your brain deciding if it wants to approach or lean into something, or if it wants to withdraw or back away. You'll see later that the subconscious measurements have been analysed and split by male and female as per the binary definitions. And this was done so that we could understand the underlying current narrative, which ultimately will give us insight to create meaningful change and move forward. So I'm going to hand over now to Michelle from the 7 Stars.
Thank you so much, Shazia. And from all the depth of work that Shazia has just outlined to us, that we've carried out over the past 6 months, entirely on Zoom, might I add, we've been able to come up with and identify 3 key themes that will help us understand the evolution of gender representation in culture today. So the first theme is gender is a story. And what we really mean by this is that for decades, if not generations, we have been subjected to many, many years of ritualized conditioning from what we've personally experienced as individuals, but also from mass media and culture. And these stories are deeply ingrained within our brains. Therefore, the way that each individual responds to different gender narratives is highly dependent on our own experiences and own contexts. However, the good news is that our brains can be reconditioned when norms that are ingrained within us are challenged, which in turn can actually drive incredibly positive engagement for brands. Therefore, the question here is, what is the role for brands when gender roles are constantly evolving, particularly at this time? The second theme that we're going to take you through is that cultural context matters. And this theme explores how brands can effectively respond to these gender shifts within society, but in a way that's inclusive and authentic, and also sensitively acknowledging the fact that gender equality is an intersectional issue, and experiences of gender actually depend on many other things, such as culture, race, social class, sexuality, the list goes on. We will talk through some practical tips so that brands can be a part of this shift and a part of this story in a really effective way that's engaging to consumers as well. Some of these tips, without having too many spoiler alerts, include using humour and also dispelling myths and taboo. And last, but definitely not least, we have she, he, they, ze, the third theme, which will help us discover what we're currently seeing in emerging culture, which is a shift between a traditional binary construct of male, female, or masculine and feminine, to a gender construct which is much more fluid, much more flexible, and much more inclusive. In fact, gender now amongst Generation Z is very much seen as a series of choices, much more than previous generations. So we'll look at brands that are already acknowledging this shift to fluidity and choice, and in turn champion inclusivity. However, we know that this is a huge topic and isn't one that can be taken lightly at all. So to help break down these themes further, we've come up with 7 key implications for brands that will help them navigate these 3 macro themes. We will explore each implication in detail over the next sort of 20 minutes or so. I'll take you through the first one, and then we'll move over to other colleagues and other co-authors of this white paper. So for Gender is a Story, our first recommendation is become a part of the evolving gender story. Secondly, we have help to create new subconscious gender narratives. For cultural context matters, we have humour is a powerful medium to challenging existing norms. Number 4, we have demonstrate empathy. And finally, within the theme of cultural context matters, we have find your cultural context. Our recommendations for he, she, they, ze are inclusivity will help build your brand community, and last but not least, represent the fluid spectrum of gender. So the first implication we're going to take you through is how brands can become a part of the evolving gender story. As previously mentioned, our brains have been subjected to generations of ritualized conditioning based on not only culture, but our own personal experiences. And because these narratives are so deeply ingrained within us, our brains respond really well to these stories because they are just a part of us. However, given the way that gender's been portrayed in culture over so many years, this can lead to reinforcement of actually quite outdated stereotypes, particularly at this time. And these stereotypes very much align with the past and not what we're currently seeing in emerging culture. However, we're at a pivotal moment of change, and brands who can challenge these deeply ingrained norms by confronting these stereotypes can help drive engagement and can help shift these perceptions and these sort of stereotype perceptions and put brands at the forefront of the evolving gender story. One brand who is doing incredibly well at this particular theme is Rihanna's beauty and fashion brand Fenty. Rihanna set up Fenty in 2017 as a challenger to the rest of the industry. She wanted to create a brand that filled a void within the industry, one in her own words, so that people everywhere would be included. However, her first efforts were all around race. She wanted to be racially inclusive within this Fenty brand, and she wanted to create a makeup line that performed well across all skin types and skin tones. However, she didn't just talk about it, she put her money where her mouth was, and she created around 50 shades of foundation, which was much before any other beauty brand had really authentically put diversity and inclusion at the forefront of their brand identity and brand mission. And she's been widely applauded for doing so, and actually other brands have since followed suit, but her brand was definitely at the forefront of this change. So that was a few years ago, and when the topic of gender and the increasing fluidity of gender became at the forefront of culture, Fenty acknowledged this shift too, and just like they've always done, she then went on to set another new standard for beauty. So this summer, Rihanna launched Fenty Skin, which is a skincare line where she promised would be for everyone. And she even expressed on social media that the true sin would be to leave her guys out. And again, very much sticking to her word in a very authentic way, she upheld that promise. And in the launch video for Fenty Skin, it doesn't just include herself and other female or female faces, but she also included 2 male rappers, Lil Nas X and A$AP Rocky. And this wasn't done in a self-congratulatory tone, but instead in a really celebratory way for men who up until this point had been treated very differently within the beauty industry and had been extremely underrepresented. So her efforts to evolve with culture is one of many reasons why Fenty is so widely applauded across the world. It has so many brand advocates and is pretty commercially successful too. I'm now going to pass you on to Holly from Neuro-Insight.
Hi everyone. So our second recommendation is help to create new subconscious gender narratives. Our brains are looking for stories, and these stories construct the reality that we live in. But this means that these stories can also create and then reinforce stereotypes, even when it isn't intentional. Some brands are overtly trying to tackle this by consciously confronting damaging stereotypes. And a really great example of this is Gillette's The Best a Man Can Be ad from 2019. So this ad tackled the subject of toxic masculinity head on. At a conscious level, I found this ad really compelling and also quite brave from Gillette, particularly in the current climate when this is a really hot topic of discussion. At Neuro-Insight, we've done a lot of work around topicality, and this has shown that when content is topical and intriguing, it engages the brain. So at a rational level, the Gillette ad seemed like a successful way of perhaps creating a new gender narrative. At Neuro-Insight, we looked at the male and female brain response to this ad, and we split it per traditional gender definitions. And what we saw was that despite this ad selling products for men with a central narrative all about men, the ad actually elicited considerably stronger memory response amongst women. We also saw stronger engagement responses amongst women. So engagement being to do with how personally relevant we find something. And we know that engagement is a key driver of then what goes into memory. At the moments when the tone became critical of male behaviour, we actually saw that men's brains tuned out and memory responses dropped off. So these results suggest that women identified with the issues explored in this ad more than men did, probably because women are more likely to have been impacted by the behaviours shown in the ad. Men, on the other hand, didn't personally relate to the behaviours shown. They tended to think more along the lines of, that guy isn't me. And in fact, when we looked at the whole picture, whilst memory and engagement were low amongst the male audience, we saw that approach response, the emotional response, was higher for men than for women, showing that men were experiencing empathy, but they didn't find the actual content relevant. So for brands, if we want to shift narrative subconsciously in a really meaningful way, it's not just about what we're talking about, because actually Gillette's intent was really honourable, tackling this subject head on. But brands need to also think about who is impacted outside of the binary gender target they are exclusively speaking to. The report goes into a lot more detail around just how critical subconscious narratives are, and frankly how easy it is for us consciously to miss something like this, even when we have all the good intentions. So the third recommendation is on humour and how powerful humour is. When it comes to humour and gender differences, there has been a lot of debate in this space for quite some time. So for example, for a while there weren't as many female comedians in the limelight because it was okay to say that women weren't as funny, which clearly isn't true. Humour is clearly a proven mechanism to engage people in an effective way, and this can be used to challenge gender stereotypes. But when it comes to advertising, historically the humour has been at the expense of women, or women's roles have been presented in such a way that female brains have been preconditioned differently and therefore perceive humour differently to the preconditioned male brain. What we found when we were looking into the white paper here was that men responded much more positively to ads that showcased gender stereotypes in a funny way than women did. And as a result, the messaging resonated much more strongly amongst the male audience than the female audience. It's not that women don't find things funny, but more that the female subconscious does not typically perceive funny narratives of gender to be as relevant for them. So for brands, this means working harder to use comedy in a way that resonates with all audiences. And an example of a brand that's done this really well recently is the Heineken ad with their 2020 Cheers to All ad, which I'm going to go through in a second. But first, I think it's quite good to mention one of their older ads, which is Walk-in Fridge. And this ad shows a couple showing guests around their new home. And you hear this high-pitched scream when the lady shows her friends the walk-in wardrobe, and it's full of shoes and clothes. But this is quite quickly drowned out by the cheers of the men who are in an equivalent walk-in wardrobe, but full of Heineken beer. This ad shows a pretty overt stereotype in quite a mocking way for women, and as a result, what we saw was memory and engagement response were pretty low for women throughout the ad. But by contrast, the more recent ad, the Cheers to All ad, shows a very different narrative which both genders can relate to. So this ad, which is shown in the image on the slide here, it starts with a couple at a bar and the waiter comes along and automatically gives the man the beer and the female the cocktail. And then there's this awkward moment when they swap their drinks over, and the ad then continues in this fashion throughout. This ad almost inadvertently made light on the stereotype existing and the awkwardness that comes with it. Crucially though, it was the awkwardness for both genders shown side by side. The strapline of this ad, Men Drinks Cocktails Too, kept the message of the underlying narrative, which is dismantling stereotypes, geared towards their primary target audience, men. But they didn't alienate women in doing so, because women were shown as part of the story and also shown to be drinking the product. So going back to my original point around men responding more positively to humour, what we saw for this ad was the way the humour was worked into the narrative felt more shared across genders, and therefore we saw engagement and memory response strong for both. So the key takeaway for brands here is that humour should be handled sensitively, but it can work across the spectrum of genders if it is done in the right way. It should definitely challenge cliches rather than reinforce them. The next one is all around empathy and to demonstrate empathy. But brands need to not just create a story, but they need to be able to demonstrate real empathy in order to build a true connection to their consumers. Particularly in the current climate with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the fact that we're living in this pandemic, consumers are really looking to brands to show authentic emotion, and empathy is really a key part of that, particularly when it comes to more taboo subjects. So for example, when talking about periods, there was a time when no advert for tampons would really discuss periods, and any blood would be shown as a blue liquid being poured from a clinical beaker, or you'd have the opposite side of that, and you'd have Mother Nature shown as an old woman wearing pearls. The recent and really powerful Body Forms Womb Stories campaign marked the end of that era. This campaign confronted both the joys and extreme pain that comes of having a womb, but without the shame. And it was almost shown in a way, as if a woman was just talking to a close group of friends about it. More recently, the Tampax ad, which is shown in the picture here, showed two women talking about periods, but also specifically talking about the ins and outs of how to use a tampon. This ad was actually banned in Ireland due to complaints about the supposedly vulgar language used, and in particular, people referring to the sentence, "You got to get them up there, girls." Unsurprisingly, there was backlash to this banning, with lots of comments on social media showing the outrage that people were still treating a subject such as periods as a taboo subject. But Brain Response gave no indication that this was a taboo subject. So again, we split this by how the male and female brain responded. And we found that female brains found the information useful enough to encode it into memory, but unsurprisingly, they encoded that information alongside a negative emotional response because, quite frankly, periods are unpleasant for many women. What we saw for men was there was no evidence that they deemed this strapline as offensive or taboo. They, in fact, unsurprisingly, and in line with what we saw earlier, they enjoyed the humorous tone, but they didn't feel the need to encode the information on how to use a tampon because that information is not relevant to them. For men, the taboo subjects such as erectile dysfunction and hair loss can be even more difficult to tackle because empathy is seen as a more emotional and therefore a more female trait. Brands such as Hims are addressing these once taboo topics, and this is covered in more detail in the white paper. When it comes to these more vulnerable subjects, by communicating with empathy, it takes away the pressure and helps to break down bodily taboos for all genders. Empathy is a human trait and therefore it is non-binary. So brands need to start treating it that way as opposed to the more binary ways we've seen it being used traditionally. So I now hand over for the fifth recommendation.
Thanks, Holly. So the next recommendation is all about finding where you sit within a cultural context. Many of the brands that we've looked at, and Tampax being a clear example of this, have focused on having a kind of natural intersection with gender. So cosmetics, body care, parenting, some of the other examples we've looked at in the white paper, they all have a more natural kind of connection to gender as a theme. But it's really crucial to remember that all brands who sell to people are representing identity in one way or another, and gender expression increasingly is a vital part of that identity representation. In other words, consciously or not, all adverts that feature people contain a stance on gender. Both dominant and emergent or future-facing social conventions within gender representation have the ability to help brands connect with their consumers. It's all about knowing your consumers or your demographic's current context and applying relevant signs and brand behaviors to show that cultural context. What a brand like Nike, for instance, has understood is that gender is an intersectional issue. So the image we can see here is from their August 2020 ad, "You Can't Stop Us," which they released as part of a video campaign. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's got a kind of split screen style of editing. And the ad really emphasizes the unity of people who play sports. So it features both elite and everyday athletes from across 24 sports. It features such sporting superstars as Megan Rapinoe, Serena Williams, and LeBron James. And the ad really demonstrates the need for intersectional equality. It relates to race, gender, but also overcoming differences and divisions more broadly. What that ad also points to is the way in which representing all genders as equals is now a baseline expectation. So to really resonate with consumers, especially Gen Z, as we'll talk about more in a moment, brands must understand how gender intersects with the need to give equal representation to marginalized groups, voices, and causes, and so on. It's not just about gender on its own within that broader cultural context. So that leads in a way into our next section, which we've called he, she, they, Z, referring to the increasing number of options and choices in self-definition and personal pronouns. The conventional binary between male and female, masculine and feminine is becoming less culturally relevant. That formerly binary approach to gender in Western cultures was shaped by a number of wider ideas and systems. If we think, for instance, of the nuclear family model, it comes with certain gendered milestones. So think of a man's career path and wage earning by contrast to what were depicted as women's achievements in the home and in family life. In such a society where men predominated in positions of power, characteristics such as confidence and independence came to be associated with masculinity, while characteristics associated with sensitivity and domestic decor came to be associated with quote unquote femininity. So those differences have long been embodied in media and advertising and in culture at large. However, now demographic and cultural changes have helped us to move away from seeing male and female or masculine and feminine as two exclusive polarities. Nevertheless, that kind of binary opposition of male and female persists a lot of the time in mainstream consumer culture, even when some brands move into a more progressive space. So for instance, earlier this year, John Lewis on Oxford Street launched a pop-up makeup counter for men. Although certainly an evolution in terms of traditional norms by having this space for men using cosmetics, that very designation of products as exclusively for males continues to conform to traditional binaries and borders between the genders. And what this takeaway and recommendation is all about is how brands can communicate gender fluidity by remembering that inclusivity is more important than exclusivity. For instance, the image shown here is from Glossier Cosmetics and from their campaign featuring Troye Sivan, actor, musician, icon, and a key part of that campaign is more to do with playfulness, exploration, and self-definition with makeup. It's not focused on the fact that he's not identifying as female in the campaign. So communicating open inclusivity in this way helps brands build a much wider and long-lasting resonant community with their consumers. The move away from gender binaries must also be understood in the context of a deeper shift away from simplified binaries at large, accounting for a more expansive, fluid, and flexible definition of identity. So that leads us into the next and final takeaway, which is all about representing the fluid spectrum of gender. So with the expanding forum for self-expression, global and local community building online, gender is losing its once central relevance as a way to define and affirm identity. For Generation Z in particular, they are far less reliant on gendered signifiers than their predecessors. Gen Z defines success according to very different milestones, and they pick and choose their identity in a more opt-in, opt-out fashion. Indeed, only 16% agree that gender is a big part of their identity in research done using Lightbox Pulse, and the majority, 75%, agree that their generation is more likely to view gender as a fluid spectrum than previous generations. There's more about that in our white paper as well. An ever-increasing range of brands are acknowledging this cultural shift toward gender as a flexible construct. So clothing and lifestyle brand The Fluid Project, pictured here, offer products for all genders, ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds, asserting that gender-free shopping is a movement, not a trend. And in 2019, even Mattel, the company behind conventionally and controversially gendered Barbie dolls, introduced the Creatable World range. Featuring a really wide range of skin colors and hair textures, the dolls come with mix and match clothes and accessories, really allowing kids to embrace a range of gender presentations, while to demonstrate that specific across the move. So they are binaries.
We seem to be having a problem with connectivity.
It's also starting.
Apologies, we seem to have a problem with connectivity here. Shazia, Holly, Michelle, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. I think it might be Katrina's connection, because the slideshare has just gone and Katrina's also disappeared. I'm sure she will be rejoining us any moment. Okay. I think Holly does actually have the slides, so we can share them again and keep moving. I'm sure Katrina will be joining us again in a moment.
Okay, well, in the meantime, why don't we tackle the question in the Q&A box, because I see there's been an exchange in chat. We could look to tackle it. It's from Liam Hodge. Do you have any advice for businesses trying to capture data on gender as we become more fluid and less binary? We have numerous forms and systems that need to be able to capture data on gender and sexuality in a way that can be analysed. Michelle, did you care to tackle that question?
Yes, thank you, Tom. It's a really, really good question, and one that a lot of clients are asking us about. In fact, at the 7 Stars, I can't tell you how many questionnaires we deal with on a daily or weekly basis, but it is plenty, I can tell you that. And actually what we're doing now off the back of this white paper is we're just trying to be as inclusive as we possibly can when asking these questions. So, for example, in a standard formal survey, you know, gender is probably one of the first questions that comes up, and traditionally you'd have just male, female as 2 answer options. I think the MRS a few years ago introduced other and prefer not to say, but actually we've now recommended to all clients, and all the surveys that we handle also has a non-binary option in there. So now, you know, there's just more choice so that respondents are, you know, they can feel really included, and we're hoping that that also brings better quality data and better quality results, because we know that, you know, we are listening to people, and we recognize that not everyone's going to fit into that male female box, and that applies to sexuality too. So we try to capture sexuality in all the surveys that we complete as well. We tend to do that at the end just because it could be considered as a slightly more sensitive question, but just, you know, even if you have a sample and there's only a few people that identify as non-binary or identify as LGBTQ+, at least they're being listened to, and at least, you know, in time you will be able to have a big enough sample to cut that data. So it's just, you know, starting now so that in, you know, months and years to come, there'll be a huge bank of that data with a robust sample. And I guess another thing is not to forget the power of qual. And Shazia probably has more to say on this, but, you know, qual can be a really, really powerful way to understand more niche groups of society in, again, a really inclusive way. So I'd say, you know, be inclusive in your questioning, but also don't underestimate the power of qual.
Oh, okay, thank you. I mean, Shazia, did you want to add anything before we go back to Katrina?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that one of the things that, you know, has become quite apparent is it's quite difficult when you say that there's 26 different iterations, and a lot of people writing screeners will say, oh, it's too much, my screener will get too long. And while I completely understand that, I think if we really want to make meaningful change, then we have to recognize that there are multiple groups, and we need to start putting them into sort of screeners, and fine, not necessarily all 26, but one of the things that I find kind of jarring, actually, when it comes to not just gender but conversations around race, is where we almost put, you know, Caucasian and then BAME. And the term BAME by any person of colour is really quite disliked, because what it does is it says white or other. And I think it's almost a similar discussion here. It's, you know, giving people who don't fit in, they don't identify with binary definitions, giving them, you know, an opportunity to express what their identity is. I think that's really important. And as Michelle said, you know, over time, that data that we will then collate will allow us to have a much clearer picture. But if we don't shift the narrative now, then we won't get that clearer picture later. So you have to start somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, we had an event in November looking at diversity and inclusion, and it really was an eye-opener, I think, to all of us. So absolutely share your point of view in that one. That's super. Katrina, are you back online?
Hello, yes, I am now back.
Hello. Okay, unlucky there with the connection. Shall we return to you to carry on with the presentation?
Thanks very much. And my Wi-Fi cutting out there is actually a perfect example of how the next point relates to kind of starting to work from home, which a lot of us have been doing this year, and how the binary between home life and work life is also breaking down in many ways. So that's another example of a binary that is culturally something we're starting to move away from. In recent years, then, this move away from male versus female or masculine versus feminine can be viewed as a move away from binaries in general and a move towards flexible self-definition in every sense. So brands have a real opportunity to actually lead the way through both understanding and representing the gender spectrum as part of, again, that broader shift toward choices and an emphasis on flexibility. And that's our final takeaway. So just on to the next slide. Thank you, Holly, for screen sharing. All of this information and more in a much more comprehensive way is available in our Beyond Binary white paper, which can be downloaded from each of our websites, the details of which are on the next slide. And you can also get in touch with any of us, sorry, on the final slide. You can also get in touch with any of us and we'd be delighted to send the report to anyone who would like a copy. And here we've just got everyone who was involved in bringing this white paper together from all of our agencies. So big picture of the team here. Excellent.
Is that the final chart in the presentation?
Just one more, asking if there are any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Katrina. Absolutely perfect. And the contact details are here for anyone who wants to get in touch. So do please take note of those contact details and do avail yourself of them. Super. Okay, well, thank you all for a really illuminating presentation. Let's go back to question time. We have a question that's popped in from Keith. Hi, Keith. His question is, how do you recommend we handle non-binary when recruiting for focus groups where these will frequently be single sex, male or female?
I'm happy to start with an answer. It's Shazia here. I think, you know, that's one of the things that's most tricky, is that we are still targeting demographically in using gender as one of the demographic targets. And us as a unit, when we were writing this report, we did have a lot of discussion around this exact subject. And what we are seeing, and I'm sure all the researchers on this webinar are seeing, is that we've been moving away over time from binary demographic definitions for segmentations anyway, and segmentations are moving more towards attitudinal sort of targeting, and that's become even more prevalent as you look in the Gen Z groups, where we're seeing a lot less binary definitions anyway. So I think it comes back to a much bigger question, which is, how do we look a step back from that, which is, how are we deciding who these targets for this research should be? I gave an example the last time that we did this webinar. I volunteered for Endometriosis UK, which is a charity for menstrual health issues. And one of the things that the charity found in their communication was it was always targeted at women. However, there are transgender people who were born with a womb and therefore suffer with this menstrual condition, but they don't identify as women. And so it's a mindset shift. And so when we say that we want to recruit for focus groups that are frequently single sex, should they be single sex? I guess it's a controversial point, but it's kind of the reason we put this white paper in place. I don't know if Michelle or Katrina or Holly, you've got anything to add? Anyone?
Perhaps not.
Nothing from me. Yeah, I think that covers it.
I think as well as just being really, you know, upfront with whoever you're using for recruitment, and, you know, if you do specifically want to speak to people that don't necessarily identify as either male or female for whatever reason that might be, then, you know, challenge recruiters to be able to do that. And I would, you know, really sort of push them to expand their portfolio so that, you know, we can recruit in the most inclusive way as possible.
Super, super. Okay, a really lovely response to the question. We have a question in from Amy Watson. Amy's asking, first of all, she says it's a really interesting point on building questionnaires. She's faced some resistance in changing long-term trackers to reflect non-binary as an option, and she's received questions on whether you should exclude or include non-binary data when looking at traditional male and female splits in data. Any thoughts or advice from the panel?
such a good question. Such a good question. I was client side for a long time, and I know that when you change any tracker, you're at risk of losing the long-term data that you've had that you're tracking against. And so organizations are very resistant to that kind of change. But I honestly think that key stakeholders need to be told that, you know, these are changes that reflect the reality of society that we live in. And if we don't evolve alongside it, our data will eventually become redundant. And so I think that that's the key point, the business case effectively to make is, if we continue to do trackers that reflect the old way of existing, the data becomes less relevant. If we shift and move into new trackers, then the old data becomes less relevant. But actually, in a forward-thinking world, I think now more than ever, given that this year has thrown most data out of the water anyway, you know, I'd imagine it's a good time as any to make those changes. Yeah, hugely valid point. I mean, as someone who started off in quant, I began my career with the mighty Kantar, and yeah, the idea of changing questionnaire was a kind of no-go, unless, of course, you parallel ran, which would always have been the way to get over, which comes at some cost. So yeah, I agree with you fully. There's no better time than now to be looking closely at the longitudinal data that's held and think about, is it time to take advantage of this window and change? So thank you, Amy. I hope that answers your question.
I've just got another point on that, actually, if you wouldn't mind.
No, talk, Carol.
So at the 7 stars, we're actually looking to redefine what nationally representative means, because traditionally it's always been on gender, binary gender, so male, female, social grade, age and region. But actually at the 7 stars, we're trying to, well, we are including ethnicity and sexuality within that now as well, because to quota on just social grade, age, region and binary gender just isn't inclusive of everyone in the UK. Lots of clients are really on board with that and have sort of changed their trackers accordingly. So now we're quoting on ethnicity and sexuality as well, which is absolutely fantastic. But other clients, to your point, to Shazia's point, are more resistant to that change. So we've come up with a middle ground whereby we're just capturing that data anyway. We're not quoting on it. So it's not going to significantly change the sample enough for it to have an effect on that longitudinal view, but at least we're capturing that data so that if they do want to quota on it in the future, then we're able to.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Hannah Rogers has put in a point. I'd love a copy of the report, says Hannah. Really interesting. So there we go. There's a big thumbs up. Hannah, if you were to visit the Sign Salad website, I'm sure you'll find it there.
Absolutely. I think we've all got a copy of it on our website, but it's also in the Sign Salad Our Thoughts section. And if anyone would like to drop us an email, we'll be very happy to send you a copy.
Okay, so it's disingenuous of me not to suppose that it would be up on all the websites. So there we go. So easily accessible on each of the different websites. That's super. Can I ask a question, which is, how do you ensure that the right balance is struck, portraying inclusivity, but not excluding sections of the target audience?
I think that the key there is about understanding what real targets should be. You know, we've got to start thinking differently about how we, and it goes back to what Michelle was saying at the 7 stars when they're redefining what NatRep is defined as. I know that some of the work that I'm doing, I'm on the MRS Diversity and Inclusion Council, and you know, we've just had a mammoth amount of data that's come through that just showcases some of the holes in, and it's not just in the industry, but it's in the way that we think about things. And that's what really needs to shift. We can change the way we think about targeting, then we're probably more likely to have a more inclusive approach to it. Because you know, if everyone has a brain, so therefore everyone has a bias, and you know, there's 86 billion neurons in our heads, and so there's a lot of stuff going on that we're not necessarily aware of, and that does mean that sometimes, you know, we don't see those things that are driving the biases, and that's where a bit more conscious awareness of and thinking differently about how we select our targets, that will be a great enabler in more inclusivity.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that. And I think another one of the important learnings for brands from this is that it's not about kind of shouting too loud or talking in a self-congratulatory way about how you're representing gender in a certain way. It's more about building it into what you're already doing and championing inclusivity, almost even in a more subtle way. So it's not a kind of brand pledge to make a huge amount of noise about it. It should become an inherent truth. And that's one way to make it feel less exclusive and more inclusive too.
Perfect. Can I ask, how did this study come about? What propelled you to do it? Is it a self-funded thing? Were you addressing a particular challenge that you faced?
It was very much self-funded, and we have the 7 stars to thank for initiating the discussions, I think. But yeah, Helen Rose, who's the head of Insight at the 7 stars, approached me at the front of the year, at the beginning of the year, pre-COVID, and then I'd met Sign Salad elsewhere as well, and I knew that they were connected to the 7 stars. And yeah, then COVID hit, and we all had a really honest conversation about the fact that, you know, we can't really afford to do anything super fancy. Let's all just plug in and do what we can with what we've got. And so we all worked tirelessly over the lockdown period to gather the insights that we could. And it was actually, I mean, I think Michelle and Katrina and Holly hopefully agree that it was actually just such a rewarding and fun thing to do at a time that was really difficult. We were able to sink our teeth into something super important, and it felt really meaningful. It still does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a spectacular initiative, to be honest. This and it fits very nicely with all that's going on in the world of diversity and inclusion, of course. Okay, well, we've run out of questions. I have no further questions either. So Suzanne, well, always one step ahead of me, has just launched the poll, so it's up on screen. So please, if I can ask the participants to complete this single questionnaire, questionnaire, which allows us to plan for the future. So the completions would be much appreciated. Normally takes about a minute for everybody to complete this. So whilst that's happening, I will say a big thank you, Katrina, Michelle, Shazia and Holly, for really a sterling presentation. It's been a great note on which to end Aura's 2020 programme of online events in what has been, I'm sure we all recognise, a very unusual, eventful and interesting year. I must again thank today's presentations, but also all our presenters this year for giving their time so freely to bring these case studies and papers on the best practice in UK market research to the Aura membership. And a big thank you to everyone who attended today's event. Thank you for joining us. The presentation will be up on the Aura website by the trusty Suzanne before you can say Jack Frost. And so we come to the end of another fascinating webinar. I'll leave you by paraphrasing the words of Ebenezer Scrooge on learning that the time before him was his own. Choose to live in the past, the present and the future, and to value human companionship. This is Tom Kerr signing off and wishing you a Merry Christmas on behalf of the team here at Aura. Merry Christmas, one and all.